So welcome and thanks again for joining us. We are starting our February series on love. And yes, part of the reason we do it is because this is Valentine's Day month, but we also do it just because it's great to spend a month focusing on the transformational power of love, that foundational, universal energy that created and sustains us and surrounds us at all times if we can only be open to it. So I hope during February we're going to explore various aspects of love. And today I'm going to talk about unconditional love. And to illustrate that, I'm going to start off with one of my favorite stories. It's the story of the four chaplains. And I think part of the reason I love it is because I am a former sailor. Many of you may know that I am a Navy veteran. And it just is so close to my heart. But beyond that, it is such a wonderful example of unconditional, selfless courage and love in action. So on February 3rd, 1943, 78 years ago this week, the troop transport SS Dorchester was traveling in a convoy of 3 ships from New York to Greenland. It was carrying 904 men. These transports, these convoys, were very, very dangerous. The ship's captain had been alerted that Coast Guard sonar had detected threats in the area, and so the ship's crew was on high alert. However, there were a great many sailors who were sleeping below decks, and a lot of them were sleeping near the engines, and it was hot, and it was uncomfortable to wear your life jacket, and so they weren't wearing them. At 12:55 a.m., 1 in the morning, a German U-boat torpedoed the Dorchester off Newfoundland in the North Atlantic, freezing waters. The torpedo knocked out the ship's electrical system, taking out all the power. They could not send out distress signals. They could not send up flares. Panic set in among the men. Just imagine this situation. Your ship has been torpedoed. It's 1 in the morning. It's dark. The water is freezing. The ship was going down fast. The Dorchester actually went down fairly fast. I just cannot imagine the terror that must have been spreading among the crew. There were 4 chaplains on board. They were George Fox, who was a Methodist, Alexander Good, who was a Reformed rabbi, Clark Poling with the Reformed Church in America, and John Washington, who was a Catholic priest. So in the middle of this darkness and panic and chaos, the chaplains sought to calm the men, to organize an orderly evacuation into the lifeboats, and to hand out life preservers, help the wounded, do whatever they could. So the supply of life jackets ran out, and although each of the chaplains was wearing his assigned life jacket, each one of them took it off and gave it to one of the men. They then helped load as many men as they could into the lifeboats. Out of a contingent of 904 souls on that ship, 229 survived. This incident, the sinking of the Dorchester, was the single greatest loss of life among American convoys in World War II. One survivor, Private William Bednar, found himself floating in the water in a sea of debris and dead bodies. This is what he recalls. He says, "I could hear men crying, pleading, praying. I could also hear the chaplains preaching courage. Their voices were the only thing that kept me going." So the chaplains remained on the ship, continuing to encourage the men getting into the boats. With their arms around each other, they prayed and they sang hymns as the Dorchester went down. As the men in the water watched and listened, they could hear songs and hymns and prayers in English and Hebrew and Latin. So Wednesday, February 3rd was 4 Chaplains Day. It was created by a unanimous act of Congress in 1988. Theirs was an amazing story of selfless love, of courage, and of sacrifice. So the U.S. Post Office normally waits 10 years after the death of an individual before they issue a commemorative stamp, but they didn't do it this time. In 1948, they issued a commemorative stamp for the 4 chaplains. It contained a picture of the 4 men and the inscription, "These immortal chaplains, interfaith in action." I love that. These immortal chaplains, interfaith in action. That's exactly what it was. 4 different faith traditions together being love in action, together supporting these men at a terrible time. So I've spoken about the four chaplains. It is a story very close to my heart, but it's also part of our history, and it's a day we should all remember. Their story resonates with all of us. Why? Because it's an example of such powerful love that inspires and strengthens ordinary people from ordinary walks of life to do extraordinary and selfless acts. Now notice I didn't call it a feeling. I mean, love can be a feeling. We're sitting here in February, and pretty soon we're going to be surrounded by cards and books and movies talking about love as a feeling. However, the love exemplified by the four chaplains and so many heroes we read about and the thousands that we never even learn about is not that. It's not love directed at a beloved like romantic love. It's not eros, but agape. It's the love that does not discriminate, that goes out everywhere and to all of life. It's the power of the divine. It's the power of spirit acting through us and as us to change our world, our lives, to make a difference in the lives of others, in our world and in our communities, in sometimes small and often extraordinary ways. So wisdom writings give us four different types of love, if you will. They are eros, romantic love, which I've just talked about. They are family love, love we have for family members, brotherly love, love we might feel toward a friend, or this highest form of love, which is agape love. The model for this is Spirit's unconditional love for all of us. So, Swedish theologian Anders Nygren says agape love is unmotivated in the sense that it is not contingent on any value or worth in the object of love. Unmotivated in the sense that it is not contingent on any value or worth in the object of love. Doesn't matter what they look like, what they've accomplished, how much they make, none of that. It is completely unconditional, heedless of self, loving others as a reflection and a channel of the universal love that created us, that sustains us, that is so freely given to us at every moment if we open ourselves to it. It's the power of spirit channeled through all of us. So the story of the four chaplains illustrates the power of this agape love to take us from ordinary moments to extraordinary actions. When I think about this story, I ask myself what was going through the hearts and the minds of those four men. Did they even think or regret, or did they just take action knowing that in that moment it was theirs to do? You know, they had families. One, George Fox, had a son who had just enlisted in the Marines, and you know he wanted so desperately to be there for that. I don't think they debated this choice in their own hearts or even among themselves, even though they surely wanted to live. I also don't think they acted out of any loyalty to a certain theology or out of any expectation that because they were religious figures, they were supposed to behave in a certain way. An act like theirs arises from a power that permeates your being, that leaves you, in a sense, no alternative, even in the face of certain death. It's a power that replaces fear with knowing, purpose, and even peace. What does the scripture teach us? Perfect love casts out fear. I can't think of a better example. So love like that, like theirs, is not limited to war, it's not limited to combat, and it's also not limited to adults. Another example of unconditional agape love that I love to remember and speak about is that by Ruby Bridges, who was a little 6-year-old African-American child who in 1960, in the middle of overwhelming national tension over school integration, was the first by herself to integrate William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. Ruby was born the year of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and the years following that decision saw amazing turmoil and violence in the United States, as many states, particularly in the South, engaged upon a course they called massive resistance. So in New Orleans, the hostility at that time was palpable. The city police, the state police, refused to help her. They would not escort her. They would not ensure her safety. They did nothing to assist her or promote the cause of integration. Ruby had to be escorted to school every day that year by federal marshals. So once inside, she sat in an empty room because all but 3 families had removed their children from the school. And those 3 white children who remained, they sat in a different classroom. There was another hero in that school. It was a teacher from Boston. Her name was Barbara Henry. And she was the only teacher who was willing to teach Ruby. And so Ruby was a class of 1 with Mrs. Henry. She studied alone. She ate lunch alone. She played alone unless she was playing with Mrs. Henry. However, she did not miss a day of school that year. Her family also suffered. Her father lost his job. Her mother, shopkeepers would refuse to serve her when she went into town. Her grandparents had sharecropped the same farm for 25 years. They were suddenly evicted. But they persisted, and Ruby persisted. So one morning, Mrs. Henry tells the story, she saw Ruby as she was walking toward the school building, moving her lips. She turned around to the crowd and was moving her lips. Now, Mrs. Henry could not hear what she was saying, but she saw her appearing to speak. Meanwhile, these crowds are continuing to press on her, to yell, to scream, to just be so venomous to this little child. Federal marshals were attempting to hustle Ruby along to get her into safety into the building. So when Ruby got to the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what she had been saying. And Ruby said she had not been talking to the crowd, but she had been praying for them. And she prayed for them on the way home as well, because, as she put it, they did not know what they were doing. This child was 6, but her courage changed the course of our history. It changed the course, certainly, of the integration of schools in New Orleans and of schools around the country. The white children eventually came back to school, and Ruby ultimately graduated from an integrated high school and went on to have a successful career and to have a family. So our children can be such amazing examples of this unconditional love in action. Time and again, they show us that it can be done. And how do they show us? Because they simply get up and do it. During this pandemic, which I have to tell you is a call to unconditional love if I've ever heard of one, how many stories have we heard during this pandemic of our children, our young people, making an amazing difference just by stepping up and being love in action? The 13-year-old who made a device making it more comfortable for healthcare workers and others to wear masks all day, he's just giving it away. The 12-year-old who made and sold yard signs to raise money for ventilators. The 11-year-old who's made and donated hundreds of masks to healthcare workers. I'm sure the minute you open the news, you're going to have your own examples. They saw a need, and they just acted to fill it, using their imagination, their creativity, and sheer persistence. Our world is transformed by these acts of love and service, and they're done for no reason other than to help another. You've seen it all, or you've done it. What are some examples? You reach out to help an elderly neighbor who needs to get her prescriptions. You reach out to help someone who cannot figure out how to get a COVID vaccine using these websites that seem to just continually lead you nowhere. You call a friend who just lost a family member. You take food to someone who's just gotten out of the hospital. These acts don't get on the news, but each one makes such a huge difference. We help because agape love is who we are in our very essence. It's the love of Spirit manifesting through us in our world. We love and we give because it's our deepest nature to do so. That is why Archbishop Desmond Tutu has said that ultimately our greatest joy is when we seek to do good for others. This unconditional love, what does it do? It moves our focus off of ourselves and onto others. And we see that time and again through actions like the 4 chaplains or actions by other heroes that we read about every day. When we love each other unconditionally, we reflect the love of Spirit that surrounds all of us. We are acting in accordance with our very essence. It's what Eric Butterworth calls being in the flow. When we live in this light of unconditional love, we remain in the flow. One of our beliefs here at One World, actually our first one, and you see them articulated on our bulletin when we meet in person. It's on the right hand side, and these are also at the bottom of our newsletter. Our first listed belief reads, "We believe in one divine spirit, manifest in all creation." So what's another way of saying that? It's all God, whatever term you use for that energy, a name or it or her or him, it doesn't matter. The Christian scripture teaches that the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. The love of spirit is given alike to all, regardless of how we show up, how much we earn or don't, what we accomplish or don't. I don't know about you, but that's such wonderful news, because so often, and especially during this pandemic, because it's so tough. I mean, I frequently fail to show up as who I came here to be. I frequently fall short of living in accordance with my divine essence. But it doesn't matter. The rain, the blessings continue to fall on me anyway. They continue to fall on you anyway. We are called to be this unconditional blessing to others as freely as we receive it. So how do we do that? Here at One World, we practice we learn about spiritual principles, we engage in practices. We like to learn about different tools that we can use to employ these spiritual principles in our lives. So how do we begin to live in the light of unconditional love? Well, for me, I think the first step is to realize that this love is so freely given to me. The word that I think of is grace. It is completely freely given. And what that means is that it needs to be freely given back. I can't take a gift that is given to me based on no merit, no accomplishment, just given for sheer love. And then as I turn around to give it back, wall it in with judgments or limitations or conditions or requirements. That's not how you give this gift. We need to give it freely and joyfully, because that is the way we receive it. We all know the story in the Christian scriptures of the Good Samaritan, in which a traveler on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was robbed and beaten up and left half dead by the side of the road. So a priest and a Levite, the two elevated members of this Jewish society, are walking down the road. They see this guy lying in the road. Do they go over to help him? No, they cross the road and keep going. A Samaritan, shunned in Jewish culture, comes by, picks him up, bandages his wounds, and takes him to a place of safety and leaves money for him to be cared for when the Samaritan leaves. Discussing this story, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The first question which the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" That's the question that love asks. That is being in the flow of universal love. That is the paradigm shift which enables us to live in that energy. Charles Fillmore wrote in Dynamics for Living that love in divine mind is the idea of universal unity. I love that. Love in divine mind is the idea of universal unity. He writes, "Love is the power that joins and binds in divine harmony the universe and everything in it." He uses the image of the heart, which is the physical representative of love in the body, as the heart keeps the blood flowing through the body. He says, in the same way, love keeps divine energy flowing through the universe. When we expand our experience of love beyond the normal limits we place on it, beyond the ties of family or friendship, to encompass all things and all people, we set free what he calls a natural, equalizing, harmonizing force that in most persons has been dammed up by human limitations. We limit love by limiting it to the known, and we are called on to be bigger. We all have the capacity to live in love as deeply as any person we've discussed here. We too have the opportunity every day to live from a place of love, not just to feel love targeted at particular people. This is the paradigm shift. It is through this energy that the divine comes into expression and lives as us, as we act in the world. By our actions, we manifest, we bring into the world all aspects of spirit: love, compassion, hope, charity, gratitude. Agape love comes alive in the act of giving. Mother Teresa has said, "Love cannot remain by itself. It has no meaning. Love has to be put into action, and that action is service." Love comes alive when we take action, when we live it. Action powered by love is joyful, it's fulfilling, explosive. It transforms us, and it transforms our world. In his book Awakening, Mark Nepo tells the story of Wu Feng, a Manchurian diplomat of the 1700s. Wu Feng was posted to an Aboriginal tribe in remote Taiwan. He appears to have befriended the Aboriginal chief, and he lived with his tribe for 25 years. So one of the practices of this tribe was to behead a member of the tribe every year as a form of sacrifice. This greatly distressed Wu Feng because he had compassion and he felt pain for the victim of this sacrifice. Every year, Wu Feng would go up to the Aboriginal chief and he would beg him to feel compassion and to not carry out this sacrifice. The chief, because he liked Wu Feng, would listen to him respectfully, would step away, and would go ahead and carry out the sacrifice. Finally, after living with the tribe for 25 years, the time came for the annual sacrifice. Instead of doing his normal approach to the chief and pleading, Wu Feng walked up to the man who was going to be the sacrifice, shoved him aside, and said to the chief, "If you are going to behead anyone, you are going to behead me." And the chief stopped. And because he loved Wu Feng, he did not behead him, and the practice stopped. Mark Nepo writes, "In the end, it is not enough to think what we know. We must live it. For only by living it can love show itself as the greatest principle." In our very being, in our very DNA, we are this principle, this truth. When we live from that truth, there is no option, but we will transform ourselves, our communities, and our world.